lights. And what they basically are is they're a reflection off of a dust cloud that exists in the solar system. It's outside, is on the side of the Earth that's opposite of the sun. And so they do, it's basically a reflection off of that dust. But they just don't, they're really only like a glow. They only occur, the zodiacal is basically only on the horizon at sun up and sundown. And Gegenschein's very small light. It's basically in the middle of the sky, but it's just a reflection of a focal point, basically, of reflected sunlight back. They can increase in intensity when there is a lot of solar wind activity, but not to the levels that would explain the illumination. Okay, which kind of leaves us not much left to look at. We've kind of hit most of the main possibilities, but we'll look at the magnetosphere light effects. And the magnetosphere is basically the magnetic field that is around the Earth that protects us from the solar wind, one thing. And the light effects from it are basically the aurora borealis, which is the northern lights, and the southern lights, and there's also the stable auroral red arc. I think I'm not really going to explain what those are at this point. I think most people know what they are. They do, they occur in basically a band. They are, and so you kind of look at that and say, well, those obviously wouldn't match a Book of Mormon event either, right? They're too far north or too far south. But we'll talk about that. They do actually have a sound event with them, which, unlike the other ones, you actually do have, well, meteor showers do have some hissing and popping that have been heard. But they're, the auroras, they've recently figured out what's going on because they're so high up, they're wondering how could anybody hear anything. But there's basically some ions that are dropping, hitting thermal layers in the atmosphere, not that far above the Earth, and it's kind of like a capacitor discharging. It'll do kind of whooshing sounds, crackling, hissing sounds. This is the SARS. It's basically, again, like the aurora borealis. It's at a lower latitude. It's not really very visible most of the time, but it can be activated when the solar winds are high, and then you get a kind of a red event. Now we're kind of getting to where basically I've arrived, the conclusion I've arrived at. That is, the Nephite event is consistent, and together, and I'll talk about what happens to the northern lights in a corona mass ejection. And essentially what you have is, the solar cycle is roughly 11 years. Every 11 years, the sun reverses its magnetic field and will throw off, depending on the collapse of portions of the magnetic field. They get in weird, the magnetic field gets in weird shapes as it's getting reversed. And of course, the sun has a very complicated magnetic field. It's not like the Earth that's fairly consistent, even though the Earth has shifted, every million years or so. And these corona mass ejections occur with some regularity, but they're usually very small. And so essentially this is what happens is, as you can see, it's not a solar flare. The solar flares are smaller. It's basically a big ejection of solar particles, solar plasma, which then impacts the Earth. And when it hits the Earth, the top picture is basically the normal, when you have the solar wind, that's how the magnetic field looks in that situation. When the coronal mass ejection hits it, it distorts the entire magnetic field, compresses it in front, and basically flattens the magnetic field on the lee side. we've only had one large, what you consider a large CME event in recent modern times. It's called the Carrington event. It's called Carrington because that was the amateur astronomer. He was looking at sunspots, and all of a sudden there's a huge bright something came out of this. Something appeared in the sunspot that was super bright, and then literally, about 12, 15, 17 hours later, this geomagnetic storm hit the Earth. And at that point in time, they obviously didn't have computers, all that, but they did have a telegraph network. And basically electrocuted telegraph operators, fried their batteries, started fires in the system. And in fact, there's actually enough residual. They could still send messages through the telegraph because there was so much residual electricity left in the system from the solar material that they could still send messages through the wires. They didn't even need their batteries because basically the system was already supercharged. The important thing related to the Book of Mormon event, obviously nobody was using telegraphs back then, so why would this be something that we would consider, is that the CMEs do something quite amazing to the northern lights. And what it does is it supercharges the northern lights and the southern lights and pushes them to much lower latitudes. And it also supercharges this Carrington event. Basically, some of the descriptions were that it was equal to the light of daybreak. There's a light that was noticeable interior of the houses in East Asia compared to a conflagration or colossal fire. Auroras were seen over the Rocky Mountains as bright as daylight, such as the glow woke up gold miners who began preparing breakfast because they thought it was morning. Same thing happened in South Carolina, birds awakened. So it actually can create illumination to the level described in the Book of Mormon. So then we have to look at the other parameters. So the illumination seems to be there when this happens. Then the question is the geographical extent. And I talked about New Mexico. What has happened? An individual scientist has taken all of the reported events back at that time frame in newspapers, et cetera, and plotted them all in. And as you can see, there were these, and I mentioned Mexico. There was even one down in Colombia. It's not shown here, but so it obviously can actually affect areas where the Book of Mormon took place. The important thing is that, and one important thing is it would be something that they had not, because it occurs so rarely, it was something that they probably had never seen. That's why it was so shocking to them. The other parameter that I mentioned that to look at is as we mentioned, it's the time period. So you've got to have at least 8 hours. You could have up to 40 hours. This actually, the Carrington event there was actually 2 specific CMEs. There were 2 that happened in sequence. So you can look at each of them individually, and you're roughly looking at 12 to 24 hours duration of each of those events. So it actually matches very well. And as you notice on the previous slide, let's just go there. Oops. One of the other things was that there really wasn't anything much occur on the other side of the planet because of short duration. This does plot a few observations of auroras, in Europe, but obviously not very much. So it also meets that requirement that it's you would not expect it everywhere. Now the Northern Lights, just kind of, these are some pictures because those look to be what's talking about when it talks about the signs and wonders. These are just Northern Lights. These aren't any very normal, regular. They're serpentine green Some of them are quite spectacular. You can imagine if you've never seen these as a primitive culture. Some you can even see faces in them, kind of, if you have some imagination. They occur in reds. They occur in, like I say, lots of different colors. This was a drawing made at during the Carrington event or after it, where it was kind of like an arc completely over the entire sky, and there was kind of like a starburst they kept talking about at the peak of the arc. Somebody drew this. I think it was on a ship or something. So then we kind of get to the effect, obviously kind of spectacular looking, and but there is another reason why they may have had impact on the people, such that, even the wicked. It wasn't just the righteous, the wicked. It was spectacular to all of them. Is these types of shapes and things, especially the serpentine, which is the more standard northern light type of feature. When you consider that Quetzalcoatl is basically, the meaning is a precious serpent or beautiful snake, which is emerald green. It's obvious seeing something like that would seem to indicate some kind of deity, representation of deity. There's also other deities in Mesoamerica, the cloud serpent. Kind of interesting is the Mesoamerican peoples conceived the area above the earth as being divided into different levels of heaven. The fifth heaven, which holds the sun, was accompanied by fire snakes made by the fire god. That's where the emanated comets and other heavenly signs. So imagine seeing a bunch of red snakes in the sky, probably who knew what they were thinking in terms of maybe that level of heaven was opened up. So there are also the Mesoamerican serpent deities have different color associations, which that's actually consistent also with what you'd see in a Northern Lights display. The Maya had the vision serpent, so they basically was a vehicle by which they would see divination or prophecy. And this kind of supposition is not something unique, because other cultures that normally see the aurora on a regular basis, like northern China and Scandinavia, they call them candle dragons, flying dragons, burning dragons, and they're integrated into their religious beliefs as well. So it would certainly be consistent with the Book of Mormon event, looking at these things in relation to a religious event. Okay, so the question is there any evidence, scientific evidence of a CME, a large CME, that we can derive from scientific inquiry? First, we look at the historical records. Again, they wouldn't necessarily have noticed anything because it wouldn't have occurred at that side of the Earth. But the CMEs are 50 times more likely, as I mentioned, at the time of the change in the solar cycle. So I actually just looked at the historical records of auroras that have been compiled. In Europe, it's mostly from literature. In China, they did record a lot of astronomical events because they were important for their kings, etc. Babylon did too, but again, it wasn't we just don't have the records from Babylon during this time period, during the time when Christ would have been born. But if you look statistically at them, they're actually like a 5 or 6 BC does work where you would expect, based on the auroral records, a change in the solar. I mean, an end of a solar cycle. Again, these average 11. It's not exactly. It's from 9 to 13 years. So it's at least consistent with that a CME could have occurred in that time frame. The other thing is they have looked at carbon-14 is generated by the solar wind or solar material. It's a daughter product of an atmospheric reaction, and it's constantly happening. That's why carbon-14 is somewhat consistent in its concentration in the atmosphere. And then the carbon dating, what happens is in your organic materials or trees, whatever, absorb it, and then it degrades over time. But they have looked at, there was one event they looked at that they've kind of think also happened like in 770 AD, where there was there was kind of an annual spike in the carbon-14 data. The Carrington event they looked at, it didn't show that. So it's not a very super definitive method. Also, the other thing is you do get the same product, the same reactions that cause a carbon-14 also cause isotopes of beryllium and chlorine, which are found in ice cores. I looked at this data. The problem was I looked at all of the carbon-14 data that they used to establish the carbon-14 curve. And unfortunately for the and basically what they do is it's dendrochronology. So they're looking at tree rings and evaluating carbon-14 in the tree rings. But for this period of time, they just had an average over like 10 years. And the same problem with the ice core data. So I couldn't really look to see if there was an annual spike. Someone would have to go in and resample those tree rings to see whether there's any evidence of a CME. And again, even if it didn't show anything, doesn't mean a CME didn't happen, because we know the Carrington event didn't show anything. So essentially, the CME meets all the criteria of the event and described in the Book of Mormon. And so, I mean, I think the conclusion is that does explain the event and all the elements. Another thing is, again, I did a translation of the characters document. It was just interesting that I did that like 5 years ago. But the glyph that's used for the wider brightness of that event, because part of the characters document was basically a synopsis of the prophetic calendar. So it did have the date for this event in the reign of the judges calendar, 92nd year. Is the sort of formed Egyptian was for brightness and white. And that Egyptian basically is hieratic. And these are the first, basically the way Egyptian works is you have monumental Egyptian, which is basically it's on your tombs and all of the temples, where you have like a full hieroglyph of animals or whatever, there's a whole variety of different things that they have. The hieratic is a shorthand version, basically, of the hieroglyph. And so, but it was interesting because the word for that was the T3 and the I10 glyphs, which make the word H with a little dot under it. So it's like a hood sound. And one of the glyphs was of a snake, a serpentine. So I guess what I'm saying is that actually the glyph seems to be actually consistent with basically a serpentine Northern Lights type of an event in the way that they described it, even though it means brightness. Then the book will eventually be on my website. All my books are for free. And I mean, not the hard copies. I don't really sell them. People want a hard copy. I do a limited edition, but can all be downloaded in a PDF form from my website. So I have Geology of the Book of Mormon. That again, that talks about the third Nephi event, and the other geological events, the collapses, the shaking of the prison, the collapsing of the prison. The Ziff magic goggles and golden plates, that was looking at the word Ziff, where that came from, and then has a metallurgical analysis of the plates and how the black lettering would have been created, and also the basically the method that was used to create the thin gold thickness on the plates. The Sumerian, that's an interesting book. It's like very long, but basically I looked at all the Jaredite and Ribe names, and it's pretty clear they're compound names from using Sumerian roots, and it explains also all the untranslated, for the most part, words in the Book of Mormon, like, Kudalam, Kuda means mountain, Lam means sheep, and Kumam, Ku means plow, like plow a field, Mam means beast. So you're probably looking at, alpacas and llamas. And one reason why they probably constructed that name is because camelids, the time the Jaredites would have left Sumer, camelids were not domesticated, so they would have had to create a word for it. And Paul's mentioned swords of Shul. That's dealing kind of with all elements of the land northward, Jaredite stuff. Evidence of the Nehor religion in Mesoamerica. That's essentially comparing. Essentially, you kind of have the Maya religion as the backdrop, apostate type religion, and it's just a comparison with the Maya religion and elements of the Order of Nehor. And then you have the two translation. I did one book in 2015. I've done an update more recently. And then Brian Stubbs' book is also available. I have a full page devoted to him with videos and that, because I actually paid for his research and paid to publish his book for him. And then it's free for download. I just pay him a little bit of money when anybody downloads it. Brian, I think Paul, he's scheduled November or something.
Yes, first two weeks of November we have Brian Stubbs on the fascicular cognates, and so he'll be getting into the Uto-Aztecan and Semitic parallels.
Yeah, this book is very linguistic heavy. He published a smaller one that was kind of more for, I guess you call lay people, unless you're into linguistics. But this is kind of the big, huge one where he goes, basically the reference book, I suppose you can call it. So
yeah, that one is for linguists.
Right. But it's been amazing. I've had downloads all over the world for that book. I mean, my books too, but just from universities all over the place. So it's actually I think putting it out for free was a great way to get his work out.
Yes, true.
So anyway, has any questions or?
Floor should be open, ladies and gentlemen. Jerry's open for questions. Wow.
Well, I think it was fascinating.